The signal from the void. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning, which seemed almost absurd given what it would mean for humanity. Dr. Sarah Chen sat in the Deep Space Monitoring Station on Luna Base 7, her coffee growing cold as she stared at the data streaming across her screens. She had been tracking cosmic background radiation, the usual mundane task that filled her 12-hour shifts, when something extraordinary appeared. It was a signal, deliberate and patterned, coming from a region of space that had been silent for as long as humans had been listening. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she ran the analysis again. The signal was old, incredibly old. According to the decay patterns and the distance it had traveled, this transmission had been sent roughly 4,000 years ago. Her mind struggled to process the implications. 4,000 years meant this signal had been traveling through space since before the ancient pyramids were built, crossing the vast emptiness between stars while humanity was still learning to write. The signal wasn't random noise or natural phenomena. It had structure, mathematics, prime numbers arranged in sequences that could only be intentional. Someone, or something, had sent this message into the void, and now it had finally reached human ears. Sarah immediately contacted her supervisor, Commander James Mitchell, who arrived within minutes, his usual calm demeanor cracking slightly when he saw the data for himself. The news spread quickly through the scientific community. Within hours, every major space agency and research institution on Earth was analyzing the signal. Teams of cryptographers, linguists, and mathematicians worked around the clock to decode the message. The world watched and waited, holding its collective breath as humanity stood on the precipice of first contact with an alien civilization. 3 days later, they cracked the code. The message was simple but chilling. It was a warning. The alien civilization that had sent it called themselves the Valorians, and they had detected something moving through their region of space. A force they described as the Devourers, a species that consumed entire worlds, stripping them of resources and life before moving on to the next target. The Valorians had sent warnings to every star system they could reach, hoping that someone, somewhere, would be prepared when the Devourers arrived. The final part of the message was the most disturbing. The Valorians had included their own coordinates, and when human astronomers pointed their telescopes at that region of space, they found nothing. No planets, no stars, just an empty void where a solar system should have been. The Devourers had already reached them, and the Valorians were gone. Governments around the world went into emergency sessions. The United Earth Council convened for the first time in its history with every nation represented. The question was simple but terrifying. If the Devourers had destroyed the Valorians 4,000 years ago, where were they now? And more importantly, were they coming for Earth? Admiral Marcus Reynolds, the head of Earth's unified defense fleet, stood before the council and delivered the news that everyone feared. Based on the trajectory analysis and the speed the Devourers appeared to travel, they would reach Earth's solar system within the next 6 months. Humanity had half a year to prepare for an enemy that had wiped out an entire civilization. The world could have descended into chaos. Panic could have spread through the streets as people realized that an unstoppable force was heading their way. But something remarkable happened instead. Humanity united. Old rivalries were set aside. Nations that had been on the brink of conflict joined hands. Resources were pooled, knowledge was shared freely, and every capable mind was put to work on a single goal: survival. Dr. Chen found herself leading one of the research teams tasked with understanding everything they could about the Devourers. The Valorian message had included some tactical information, descriptions of the enemy's capabilities and weaknesses they had discovered before their fall. The Devourers traveled in massive hive ships, organic vessels that could repair themselves and adapt to different forms of attack. They had technology that could drain a planet's core, weapons that could crack continents, and shields that seemed impenetrable to conventional weapons. But the Valorians had also discovered something crucial. The Devourers relied heavily on a form of psychic network to coordinate their attacks. They were a hive mind, billions of individual creatures acting as one under the control of a central intelligence. This gave them incredible coordination, but it also meant they had a critical weakness. If the network could be disrupted, even temporarily, the individual devourers would become confused and vulnerable. Admiral Reynolds immediately began working with his strategists to develop a plan. Earth's fleet was impressive by human standards, with hundreds of warships equipped with advanced weapons and shields. But compared to what the Valorians had possessed, and they had still fallen, humanity's military might seem inadequate. They needed something more, something unexpected that the Devourers wouldn't anticipate. The answer came from an unlikely source. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a quantum physicist who had been working on experimental communication technology, proposed a daring idea. If the Devourers used a psychic network, then perhaps humanity could create a jamming signal, something that would interfere with their ability to communicate and coordinate. It would require building a massive array of quantum transmitters, devices that could generate a field of disruptive energy across a wide area of space. The project was named Operation Silence, and it became humanity's top priority. Factories across Earth were retooled to produce the necessary components. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock. Scientists collaborated across time zones, sharing data and breakthroughs in real time. The construction effort was unprecedented, with resources from every nation flowing into the project. Meanwhile, other preparations were underway. The defense fleet was expanded and upgraded with new weapons based on Valorian technology. Planetary defense platforms were constructed on the Moon and Mars. Evacuation plans were drawn up for Earth's major population centers. Every person on the planet was given a role to play, whether it was building defenses, stockpiling supplies, or simply staying informed and ready to act when the time came. As the months passed, Sarah Chen continued to monitor deep space, watching for any sign of the approaching threat. She had become something of a celebrity, the person who had first detected the Valorian warning, but she tried to ignore the attention and focus on her work. Every day she scanned the stars, looking for the telltale energy signatures that would indicate the Devourer's arrival. Then, with just 2 weeks left before the projected arrival date, she found them. A massive fleet of organic ships, moving through space like a swarm of locusts, heading directly for Earth's solar system. The sight on her screens was terrifying. There were thousands of them, each one larger than the biggest human vessel, their surfaces pulsing with an eerie bioluminescent glow. Sarah sent out the alert, and within minutes, every defense force in the solar system was on high alert. The Devourers were coming, and they were exactly as horrifying as the Valorians had described. But humanity was ready. Operation Silence was complete, the quantum transmitters were in place, and the defense fleet was positioned for battle. 4,000 years ago, the Valorians had sent their warning hoping someone would hear it and be prepared. Now, as the Devourers approached Earth, they were about to discover that humanity had received that message and had spent every moment since preparing for this fight. The battle begins. The Devourer fleet emerged from the darkness between planets like a nightmare made manifest. Their ships were unlike anything humanity had ever seen, massive organic structures that seemed to breathe and pulse with malevolent life. Each vessel was covered in what looked like thick armor plating, but closer scans revealed it to be a living tissue that could regenerate damage almost instantly. The smallest of their ships was 3 times the size of Earth's largest battlecruiser, and there were thousands of them spread across millions of kilometers of space. Admiral Reynolds stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, Earth's flagship and the command center for the entire defense operation. Around him, officers worked at their stations with focused intensity, monitoring the approaching enemy and coordinating with the other fleet groups positioned throughout the solar system. The plan was complex, relying on precise timing and coordination, but Reynolds had confidence in his people. They had trained for this moment, running countless simulations based on every scrap of information the Valorians had provided. The first phase of the defense would be conducted by the Outer Fleet, stationed near the orbit of Neptune. Their job was not to stop the Devourers, that would be impossible, but to slow them down and gather as much tactical data as possible. Captain Elena Rodriguez commanded this force from the UES Vanguard, a heavy cruiser equipped with the latest scanning technology and long-range weapons. As the Devourer fleet drew closer, Rodriguez gave the order to engage. Railgun rounds, each one traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, streaked across the void toward the enemy ships. The weapons struck their targets with devastating force, and for a moment, the human crews watching from their vessels felt a surge of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The damaged sections of the Devourer's ships began to regenerate almost immediately, the living tissue flowing like water to seal the wounds. Rodriguez expected this based on the Valerian data, but seeing it happen in real time was still unsettling. She ordered her ships to switch to plasma weapons, hoping the intense heat would prevent the regeneration. The brilliant blue streams of superheated matter carved through the void, striking the enemy with temperatures hot enough to vaporize steel. This time, the damage seemed to last longer, the organic armor taking more time to repair itself. It wasn't much, but it was something. The Devourers responded with their own weapons. Strange organic cannons emerged from the surfaces of their ships, firing projectiles that looked like living creatures encased in energy fields. These projectiles moved with unnatural agility, dodging defensive fire and seeking out their targets with disturbing intelligence. When they struck, they didn't just damage the ship, they seemed to bore into it, eating through the hull and spreading like an infection. The UES Horizon was the first casualty. The destroyer took multiple hits and within minutes its hull was compromised in dozens of places. Captain Maria Santos ordered an evacuation, and her crew made it to the escape pods just before the ship's reactor went critical. The explosion was brilliant but brief in the vacuum of space, a momentary star that faded as quickly as it had appeared. Back on the Defiance, Admiral Reynolds watched the battle unfold with a grim expression. They were losing ships, but they were also gathering data. Every attack, every defense, every tactic the Devourers used was being recorded and analyzed. The artificial intelligence systems aboard the command ship were processing this information, looking for patterns and weaknesses that human observers might miss. Captain Rodriguez pulled her forces back after an hour of engagement, retreating toward the inner system as planned. She had lost 3 ships, but the rest of her fleet was intact and they had accomplished their mission. The data they had gathered was already being transmitted to every vessel in the human fleet, updating their tactical databases and refining their attack strategies. The Devourers pursued, but they were cautious now. They had expected easy prey, a primitive species that would fall before their might like countless others had before. Instead, they had encountered resistance, organized and effective. It wasn't enough to stop them, not yet, but it was enough to make them wary. Dr. Tanaka watched the battle from the control center of Operation Silence, located on a fortified station hidden in the asteroid belt. Around her, technicians monitored the quantum transmitters that had been positioned throughout the solar system. These devices represented humanity's best hope, and Tanaka felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. The transmitters needed to be activated at precisely the right moment, when the Devourer fleet was deep enough into the solar system that they couldn't easily retreat. The second phase of the defense began as the Devourers crossed the orbit of Jupiter. The gas giant's moons had been converted into weapons platforms, each one bristling with missile batteries and energy cannons. As the enemy fleet approached, these platforms opened fire in a coordinated barrage that lit up the darkness with thousands of explosions. The Devourers took casualties for the first time. Several of their smaller vessels were destroyed outright, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire. But the larger ships weathered the storm, their organic armor absorbing incredible amounts of damage. They returned fire, and one by one, the moon platforms went silent, their defenses overwhelmed by the superior firepower of the alien fleet. Admiral Reynolds gave the order for the main fleet to engage. Hundreds of human warships accelerated toward the enemy, their crews ready for the fight of their lives. The space between Jupiter and Mars became a battlefield unlike anything in human history. Ships maneuvered and fired, missiles streaked through the void, and energy weapons carved brilliant lines across the darkness. The humans fought with a ferocity that surprised the Devourers. Every ship captain knew that retreat was not an option. Behind them was Earth, their home, and they would defend it with everything they had. The UES Defiance led the charge, Admiral Reynolds standing calmly on the bridge even as explosions rocked the ship around him. His confidence was infectious, spreading through his crew and inspiring them to fight harder. But for every devourer ship destroyed, 2 human vessels fell. The mathematics were simple and brutal. At this rate, the human fleet would be decimated long before they could significantly damage the enemy force. Reynolds knew this, had known it from the beginning. The fleet's job was not to win this battle outright. It was to buy time. Dr. Chen, monitoring the battle from Luna Base, watched the casualty reports with growing horror. She knew people on many of those ships, colleagues and friends who were now fighting and dying in the cold void of space. But she also knew that their sacrifice was not in vain. Every minute they held the devourers back was another minute for the civilian population to reach the shelters, another minute for the final preparations to be completed. The devourers pushed forward relentlessly, their numerical superiority allowing them to absorb losses that would have crippled the human fleet. They were approaching Mars now, and on that red planet, millions of people huddled in underground bunkers, hoping that the defenses above them would hold. The Martian Defense Force, consisting of older ships and militia volunteers, rose to meet the threat, adding their firepower to the desperate battle. As the fighting raged, something unexpected happened. The Devourer hive mind, which had been coordinating the attack with perfect precision, began to show signs of confusion. Ships that should have been working together started making independent decisions. Attack patterns became less coordinated. It was subtle at first, but to the trained observers monitoring the battle, the change was unmistakable. Dr. Tanaka saw it too, and a smile crossed her face for the first time in days. The quantum transmitters were working. Even though they hadn't been fully activated yet, the passive interference they generated was already affecting the Devourer network. She sent a message to Admiral Reynolds, informing him of the development and recommending that they accelerate the timeline for full activation. Reynolds received the message and made his decision instantly. He ordered all fleet groups to fall back to the final defensive line, positioned between Mars and Earth. It was time to spring the trap. The Devourers, sensing victory, pressed their attack harder, pursuing the retreating human forces with increased aggression. They were moving exactly where humanity needed them to be, entering the zone where the quantum transmitters would have maximum effect. On the Defiance, Admiral Reynolds stood and addressed his crew over the ship-wide communication system. His voice was calm but carried the weight of the moment. He told them that they had fought bravely, that they had honored Earth and all of humanity with their courage. He told them that the next phase of the battle would determine the fate of their world, and that he was proud to serve alongside each and every one of them. Then he gave the order that would change everything. Dr. Tanaka, receiving the command, activated Operation Silence at full power. The quantum transmitters, spread throughout the inner solar system, began to generate a massive field of disruptive energy. The effect on the Devourers was immediate and dramatic. Their hive mind, the psychic network that bound billions of creatures into a single coordinated force, shattered like glass under a hammer. Across the Devourer fleet, chaos erupted. Ships collided with each other as individual pilots suddenly had to think for themselves. Weapons fired randomly as the coordinated targeting systems failed. The organic vessels began to thrash and writhe as the creatures within them panicked, cut off from the collective consciousness that had defined their entire existence. For the first time since the battle began, humanity had the advantage. Admiral Reynolds, seeing his enemy in disarray, ordered the fleet to attack with everything they had. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the chance to strike while the Devourers were vulnerable. The human ships surged forward, weapons blazing, and this time their attacks found their mark. Devourer vessels exploded or went dead in space, their organic systems failing without the hive mind to sustain them. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, victory seemed possible. Earth's defenders had turned the tide, proving that humanity, when pushed to the brink, would fight back with everything they had.